Welcome to How to Decide When to Use What in Office 365. This presentation includes quite a bit of content, so we've made it about 50 minutes in length. There's a similar presentation that we did at Microsoft Ignite that's about an hour and 15 minutes. So if you're looking for a longer version or you have the time to spare, I highly recommend taking a chance and going to the Microsoft Ignite Channel 9 collection and looking through for the same topic and title. But this will be a shorter version for many of you who you just don't have that much time to spare, and we'll cover a lot of the same topics and key considerations. In addition to this session on when to use what in Office 365, the what being SharePoint, Yammer, Office 365 Groups, Outlook, Skype, Delve, OneDrive for Business, and more, we wanted to highlight the fact that we actually have a white paper available for you. So if you go to whentousewhat.com, this is a free public draft of the white paper that we're working on, where we're actively pursuing people, customers, Microsoft individuals, and others who've already given us some feedback, and we've incorporated that into the white paper, but we're continuing to optimize it and improve it based on what's working for other people and to provide better guidance on when to use what. So again, think of this as it's the current white paper, but it's an open draft. So if you have suggestions on how we might be able to take it to the next level, we are very interested in updating and improving this white paper. So again, please, as an action item following this presentation or during the presentation, download the white paper so that you can maybe dig in a little bit deeper where we don't have time in the 50 minutes we have today to really dig into some of these scenarios in Office 365 and more. My name is Richard Harbridge. I'm a speaker. I've authored a couple of books, and I'm super friendly. So it's really important to note if you have any questions beyond what we covered today, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on my blog at ToDoLead. So my email address at ToDoLead is richard@todolead.com. And of course, Kanwahl Khipple, who's also my co-presenter and has done tons of great stuff, including helping me co-author the white paper. He's also someone I work with regularly. His Twitter handle is shown at the bottom there. He's also very accessible from LinkedIn. And yes, he's super good looking, but he's also super friendly. So feel free to reach out to him as well at Kanwahl, that's his name, first name, at todolead.com as well. We're really anxious to hear feedback, and we're really excited when we get to hear about customers and people who have different challenges, because in many cases we've experienced the same things, or we've found other customers and we can kind of connect you with people that have kind of overcome or circumvented some of those challenges. So speaking of challenges, the big challenge that we had when we tackled this session and this idea of when to use what in Office 365 was that answering this question, when to use what, and providing guidance on that was really challenging. And it was challenging for really 5 reasons. What we found was many people, when they think of this question, when should I use what? They often think of these comparisons, right? They're looking for sort of a quick comparison of here's when you should use this, here's when you should use that. And while this was true traditionally for one on-prem technology and another, or from one enterprise investment from another investment, it's not so true in a suite of interconnected services like Office 365. So we're actually going to explain what those 5 big challenges we experienced were. We're going to do this relatively quickly because I want to spend a little bit more time on the other sections of the presentation. But again, this is the 5 reasons answering when to use what is actually more challenging than it might seem on the surface, and why a simple comparison like this isn't really what you're probably looking for. So the first key consideration is that historically, as mentioned, SharePoint versus Yammer, or this technology versus that technology, that's not the right way of approaching this. A versus approach is not a good, conducive approach for getting the right answers to when to use what in Office 365, because often it's an and discussion. Office 365 is meant to be leveraged together. Different capabilities within the platform are meant to be leveraged in a complementary way. And so often what we're actually trying to do is not go, this product versus this product. We're actually trying to provide, well, if you use SharePoint and Yammer and you do it in this way, you'll actually realize even more value, right? So you use SharePoint and then you use Document Conversation View with a document, and that enables you to use SharePoint and Yammer. Or you use SharePoint and you have a Yammer embedded feed, and that allows you to have the power of Yammer Social, but also many of the benefits of SharePoint, and so on and so forth. This is also true if you say we want to use SharePoint and Outlook, or SharePoint and Yammer and Outlook together, right, in really interesting and effective ways, or Skype for Business, OneDrive for Business, and the list goes on and on. It really doesn't matter what the technologies are that we're talking about. This "and" concept is really critical. So keep in mind that when we look at using technology together, it's important not to think of it from a versus perspective, because that's going to take you in the wrong approach, where you're not going to necessarily think of the best cases and the best scenarios where you can use all of the capabilities together. You want to think of those scenarios. The "and" approach is a much more effective strategy. The second challenge that we realized was difficult and had to be overcome was that you have multiple levels that you have to answer this question. You answered at the organizational level with things like, hey, this is our strategic decision. We are deciding to use for messaging and calendaring Exchange Online and Outlook. And that's going to be our corporate email and calendaring solution. It's going to, enable us to do this, this, and this. That's the high-level guidance. And then, of course, think twice before using it in this example for personal email communication. So you're setting some general, and this is very simplified, but you're setting governance at a broad level that's applicable across the organization. And you're saying this is strategically why we're investing in this technology. So that's something you should have. You should absolutely have an answer for when to use what, or why are you doing certain things from an enterprise technology strategy perspective. And these are some examples of that. And of course, inside the white paper, there's quite a few more, and it goes into a little bit more depth. So we do need to recognize that we answer this at the organizational level. What we found is that answering at the organizational level, that's foundational, right? If you don't answer that at the organizational level, it's much harder to provide guidance on when to use what at the group or individual level. Another way of looking at group, by the way, here is thinking of champions. If you're familiar with SharePoint, site owners. If you're familiar with Yammer, community managers. Think of the people that are leading, right, different activities within Office 365. Those types of people tend to be group level, so there's a little bit of different guidance you'd give them than you might give sort of a typical user, because they're different levels in terms of the complexity of what they're doing and potentially the levels of contribution and coordination and things that they might be doing. So what I'm really saying here is what we found was many companies actually realize that they do need strategic technology advice and governance and other things that dictate, when we should use what, generically speaking, in our business, and that's foundational. But a lot of them didn't spend a lot of energy on individual or group level guidance. And so what we're recommending is you do need that organizational guidance at a minimum. And if you're, for whatever reason, struggling with that, feel free to reach out. We've got lots of samples for how to build that beyond what's in the white paper. And then once you've done the organizational guidance piece, you really need to spend an appropriate, actually much more time on group level guidance, champion level guidance, coach level guidance, that type of thing. And then beyond that, you need to spend even more time on sort of individual or user guidance. And if you don't do that, what you'll find is you're not going to be able to optimize and maximize the return on your Office 365 investment as much as someone else who is doing this type of investment is going to. So again, just the idea that you need to answer this question, when to use what, at the organizational level, you have to answer it at the group level and the individual level. Another challenge we realized when we tried to answer this question on when to use what is that knowing which product to use isn't enough. It's not a sufficient answer, because actually saying something like SharePoint is a great part of the solution, that's not enough, because inside of SharePoint, you get into all sorts of other interesting complexities, right? Should I create a list column, a site column, or a content type column? Should I create a new library, a new folder, or a new site? These are the types of things that users make continual judgments on, and we need to provide guidance not just at the quote-unquote product level, like SharePoint level, but we also have to provide the guidance at a deeper level. So keep in mind that the guidance isn't just multiple levels from an organizational, group, and individual level, but it's also deeper than the high-level abstracted product. And that's really critical, because a lot of the guidance you might find tends to be at that higher level. Another big one we realized that this is a challenging question to answer is that people don't make one decision. This is an iterative process. In other words, what people often do when they are trying to answer when to use what in Office 365 and what they're actually actively doing is they have an understanding of their problem. They go and try and solve it with some sort of capability in Office 365. Then they learn more about their problem and they learn more about Office 365. And as a result, they tackle it in maybe a different way. And they keep going through this sort of iterative approach, and it's a very subjective learning process. So it's not as traditional in terms of the way people learn as historic methods. And so when you provide the guidance, you also have to keep in mind that your guidance needs to be iterative, that it needs to mature with the individual as they explore different facets and capabilities within Office 365, and it needs to be a bit more tailored. And it needs to certainly be really flexible when you think about the fact that people need to be able to consume it in very small bite-sized chunks, as well as potentially, in training and optimized scenarios versus, these ones that are just helping me understand that, hey, there's maybe a better way I can do something, generically speaking. So again, there's multiple levels, if you will, even in terms of how we deliver the answer to when to use what. And then, of course, and this is a tricky one to explain, but what we find is when we've explained how to use Office 365 better, sometimes users, they have favorites, right? They find that some technologies work really well for them and that they can solve all their problems with that one technology. That doesn't mean that they can solve every problem as efficiently with that technology. There's often better ways of doing it, but that they can solve every problem. So Outlook is a great example of this, right? Most things that you need to do, you could do in Outlook. It just might take more time, or it might be, more frustrating to use Outlook. And so if Outlook's all you know, then everything is going to look like an Outlook problem to be solved. Similarly, if SharePoint and Outlook is all you know, then everything might look like a SharePoint problem. I know this is something many people have seen in the SharePoint world, right, where SharePoint's being used for things that maybe it's not, optimized for. So keep in mind that what we're really saying in this last challenge is that people have to sustain that commitment to learning and discovering and reinvesting in their own knowledge of the product and how to optimize their usage in Office 365. And this isn't easy to achieve, but there are ways of actually achieving and sustaining commitment. So quick summary, because I know that was really, really rapid. Technology works best together. Stop with the versus discussions. The versus discussions leads you down a path that's not optimal for the way Office 365 works and the way that people actually behave. People work with all the technologies and they go from one to another, and Office 365 facilitates that with the app launcher and with integration throughout the product. So we really want to make sure that we're looking at things from an and perspective from the beginning. We have to look at group, organizational, and individual level guidance. We need to also look deeper than the high level abstracted guidance on the product, because if you are only at that level, it's really superficial and it's not going to be that useful for groups or individuals that use it. It might be good enough for organizational, but it's not going to be good for the deeper levels. And then people aren't making a one-time decision. Remember, this is iterative, so we need to make sure our guidance is also being improved on a regular basis and iterating, but that it's also consumable in a way that matches the way people are learning. And then sustained commitment is critical. Sustained commitment is probably the most important thing to take away from this section of why this is so challenging. So what we want to do is we want to drive sustained commitment. And to get sustained commitment, that means we need to have three things. We need these three things to constantly be moving and being invested in and important in order for us to, basically have and sustain commitment. We need to have interest, we need to have understanding, and we need to have a sense of value or realization of value. And you can't realize value without understanding something, right? And you can't necessarily understand something or sustain understanding if you don't have interest in it, right? So that's really what we're saying is you need interest, then you can basically sustain understanding. Sustained understanding leads to realization, continued realization of value, which leads to sustained commitment. But these are all interrelated. So what I want to do is I want to dig into each of these, and I want to talk about them over the next little while. Keep in mind that while I'm talking about these things from an individual perspective, it's also very true from an organizational group level. So shared interest leads to shared understanding, leads to shared value realization, and then that leads to shared commitment. So again, this is a formula that works for many contexts, but for today, we're going to use it in the context of providing guidance on when to use what in your organization for Office 365. In my opinion, the interest section is the easiest. So we're going to spend a pretty short amount of time on this, and we're going to spend most of our time in the understanding section because that's where a lot of the guidance comes into play. But it is really critical to drive awareness and drive interest. So that's really what we're doing in this first stage, right? When we want to sustain commitment, we need to make sure that there's sustained interest and there's sustained awareness, or at least constant effort, proactive effort in driving awareness in the organization. So let me give you an example of how to potentially approach this. Inside of improveit.how/book, this is an ebook that a number of great authors in the SharePoint community have written. There's a chapter that I wrote that's about, 9,000 words or something like that. And they cut me off. I couldn't put everything in that chapter, but that's okay. We'll roll out a white paper soon. Inside of this chapter, you'll actually see I've listed quite a few, I don't know the exact number, but at least over 20 awareness-based adoption activities. So these are activities that other organizations have done. These are proactive activities, campaigns, things like hosting a launch event, holding certain contests or competitions, creating fake profiles that are, based on seasonality, like a Santa Claus profile, or, based for humor, or official profiles, etc., to encourage people to go and navigate things like Delve or user profiles. So there's a lot of specific examples that are outlined in this, and there's quite a few. So the key here is, if you want to drive interest and you want to drive awareness, you need to do something. You need to do activities. And I've kind of given you a sampling of those activities in this. And then, of course, you can always reach out if you want some more, or look at the community. There's a lot of other examples of how people have driven awareness and interest. One of my favorite ones is a 31-day campaign on Office 365, where you do a variety of these activities and you report on them and you kind of assess each week what main results you're trying to achieve based on the tips that you're doing regularly per day, based on the competition that you do at the weekend, things of that nature. Anyways, I don't have this could easily be an entire deck, and I actually have one called 50 adoption activities, over 50 adoption activities for Office 365. But for now, just understand that we love adoption, and the reality is, if you want to drive interest and awareness, the best way to do it is to do activities and campaigns. The second thing to note with adoption and driving awareness is that if we're driving interest and awareness, we need to make sure that we know what the current state of the organization is, and we know what responsible level of interest or awareness we can potentially achieve. So in this example, this is actually data from a customer that we were working with, and they were basically assessing their current active usage of Office 365. And you can see that Outlook and Skype for Business were pretty heavily used and leveraged, but SharePoint and OneDrive for Business and potentially Delve and other things really could get a lot of benefit if people were to use it more often. What we found is OneDrive for Business, most users, when we surveyed them and canvassed them, weren't aware that OneDrive for Business was available to them. They weren't even aware that this was a capability that they had. And so what we had to do is just do a series of awareness campaigns, and we saw immediately OneDrive for Business uptake in terms of usage. And so sometimes it's just an awareness thing. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. For the SharePoint side, they had a hybrid environment, and they actually had a bit of SharePoint usage on the on-prem world, but what they were trying to work out is how do they kind of make that shift into the online world. And once we had made a couple shifts and some changes to the internet, we saw a significant growth and uptake in active SharePoint usage. And then, of course, more business processes and workflows and things like that really helped make it a more regular usage pattern from a SharePoint perspective. So there's lots of specific examples that we could give from customers, but the idea here really is just to track usage, right? Tracking usage is one way of potentially tracking awareness, or at least guiding where you might need to drive a bit more awareness inside the organization. And if you find that after you've driven awareness, you're not seeing usage uptake, then perhaps it's a more complicated issue and you need to explore it further. In addition to that, we wanted to give an example here. This is app experiences. So one of the app experiences that Office 365 provides is a Delve app. That's what you're seeing here. There's actually a Yammer app. There's a OneDrive for Business app. There's an app that's coming for groups. There's so many apps and app experiences for Office 365. So here's an example where Microsoft has actually tried to drive awareness and interest. This is based on customer demand. And in your organization, I guarantee most users are working from anywhere at any time on any device. And when they're working on any device, isn't it better to have an optimal experience on that device? And so what we want to do is perhaps campaign and make sure we're tracking how many people are actually using the Office 365 apps in our organization. And is this an opportunity to help them work a little bit more effectively, right, by using these apps and having a little bit more of a guided or personalized experience. So really what I'm using is one example. There's many examples like this where Microsoft actually provides capability that you're not leveraging. Azure single sign-on, where you can actually have other third-party applications or SaaS app-based applications show up in your app launcher is another example. There's many interesting examples that we find that customers have not deployed or they haven't spread awareness, but the capability is, a couple clicks away for them to be able to both monitor, manage that, and then potentially drive a better experience for their users. And so these are things that you can do, which will also drive interest and awareness, because if people have an app, they'll be curious, well, what is that like and how does that work, and so on and so forth, and it creates the right types of questions and engagement. Another big one here is if you're trying to drive interest and awareness, it's really difficult if you're working on legacy technology, or in the example I gave earlier, if you have a hybrid scenario or something like that. So it's important to recognize that driving interest and awareness is going to be a little bit different for each organization, but it's much harder for people to be interested in developing further understanding if it's on a legacy or older technology. And this makes sense, right? I'm not really that interested in learning that much more about an older version of SharePoint when in the marketplace it's not, that old technology of SharePoint and that old SharePoint experience isn't really in demand, right? What's in demand is the newer technology and the newer experience. Similarly, on the end user side, I don't want to have to learn, or I don't want to spend a lot of cycles learning and optimizing my usage of an old technology when my expectations are at some point soon, hopefully, will be on a newer technology. So it's really critical for once people are on Office 365 for them to get an idea that, hey, this is actually really important. This is strategic for your career. And it's just as important to have Office 365 skills as it is to have Word or Excel skills. And I think when you put it in that context, it's certainly a lot easier when you're on or off legacy technology. So if you're struggling for whatever reason to get off that legacy technology, or you're struggling in a hybrid for an extended period of time, because again, hybrid is meant to be hopefully a transitionary state, then feel free to reach out and I can give you more prescriptive guidance, or Kanwahl can. So that's interest in a nutshell that we've covered. Now for the hardest one, understanding and guiding understanding. So this is where the meat of the presentation is going to be. I'm going to be as fast as I possibly can, but you may want to rewatch this recording specifically for this section. So to guide understanding, what we need to do is we need to approach this in a couple ways. The first thing we need to understand is that it takes time for people to have an improved experience, or to have benefits that they receive, right, from an impact perspective, from a new way of working. So naturally, when you introduce a change, when you introduce new capabilities or a new way of working to an individual, they're not going to be as efficient as the old way that they were working. What we want to do is we want to manage this change and be a part of it, because we can actually reduce those negative consequences. We can even have this dip actually happening during training or in a safe environment, so that the user doesn't become discouraged or frustrated and decide to go back to the old way that they were working. And we can actually get to accelerated results quicker. So what we're really saying here is, don't leave it. It's important to be a part of the change and to take proactive action when it comes to guiding understanding. And the way that you do that is by literally providing guidance, coaching, education opportunities, training opportunities, and other things like that. Also note that if you're worried about that little dip in productivity that gets introduced when you introduce a new productivity change, it's important not to delay until you're at such a significant disadvantage, or until you have to introduce a significant amount of change in order for your organization and the individuals in your organization to remain productive and competitive in the marketplace. So again, really critical. You don't have to be first person to deploy or to introduce new changes in your organization, but it's really important not to wait too long, because if you do, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And so are all the users in your organization that haven't had the opportunity to potentially use some of these new capabilities or better ways of working. In addition to that, what we found is that using the best tool for the job is really important. And when you think of guiding users, what we're saying is there's one element of this which we talked about in interest, which is helping them understand what exists. What are all the tools and technologies and capabilities they have available to them that might be able to help them.
what we need to do now is we need to help them understand when to use certain tools to better, accomplish some of the results they're looking for. When we looked at the research online for this, and we looked at a lot of different customers that we had this discussion on, what we found is customers really kind of lean towards at least two key variables. When we started to talk about which tool works in which scenario, there was a sense of time sensitivity that was really important. And then there was the audience type and size that was really, really critical for a lot of organizations. And when you understood the urgency in the audience, when we understood those two things, it was much easier to provide a suggestion on which tool might make sense in which circumstance. We also found that for some organizations, they wanted a visual way of representing the current state of their organization or a future state. And so what this matrix represents is a visualization of perhaps how their organization functions today, or how they could function, or how maybe they should function. So if we're thinking about guidance, one of the ways we want to guide it is visually with a matrix like this, with at least these two variables. Let's take another step on this. What we found was when we talked with different organizations, and when we did a couple of these, we've actually implemented a number of these sort of visual matrices with organizations. They were different for different organizations. So for an organization that was a little bit more communication focused than collaborative focused, they weren't really using team sites in the same way. They were actually really more focused on publishing sites, and they were really leaning in towards the new Skype for Business broadcasting capabilities and some other things of that nature. And so for them, the way that the matrix looked was different than someone else. Another one was an organization who had sort of an authoritative, so if you're an authority or an official person, these are the different communication mediums that you should use in these circumstances. That was very different visually from a matrix perspective than what a common user might have, or a persona inside the organization. So think of this matrix not as a static matrix where you have like one matrix to fit them all. What you want to do is you actually want to have a series of matrices or make this dynamic. Keep in mind the goal here is to visualize and help guide from an organizational or group perspective how people might use or interact with technology in the organization. It's not necessarily to give prescriptive guidance, because that's going to get a little bit more into scenarios and some other stuff which we'll talk about. Lastly, what we ran into on the matrix side that was really critical was that there's a big transition path that people go through sometimes when they go from one of these technologies to another. In other words, some technologies have benefits that are personal or individual, and some have benefits, at least by their nature, that are a little bit more collective. And so an example of this is OneDrive for Business. A lot of people will adopt it and use it because it helps them. It gives them versioning. It gives them anywhere, anytime access to their documents. It gives them all sorts of these benefits, right? That's something OneDrive for Business gives them. But when they put a document into shared with everyone, the reason that they often do this, the reason they expose or share documents, is because that's providing collective benefit to others, right? Now, there's some individual benefit for sure, but again, it's largely collective benefit. Yammer is a great example of this as well, but so is Office 365 groups, where perhaps instead of just sharing with everyone, we might take a step further and we might even share things within an Office 365 group. So in the first one, a great example of kind of getting people to work a little bit more transparently or openly, basically changing behavior, is to get them to start to put more documents where appropriate in the shared with everyone folder. And another example, getting people to use Office 365 groups because they're quite intuitive, is a great way for people to share documents with trusted peers, right? A small group or a large group potentially of trusted peers that I feel comfortable that there's sort of a shared sense of ownership for content I put inside of this group. So that's another great example of when a user might take a little bit more of a transparent, visible, or open way of working. And then lastly, you might even take a document in that group and then reference it in a Yammer conversation. So you use the Yammer conversations pane, and that provides more people access to the document. More from a view perspective, it provides more people the ability to comment and provide questions or reference it in new ways. And so this is an even more open way of working. So there's sort of this transition, right? as the user goes from OneDrive for Business to Office 365 groups to Yammer groups, and I'm simplifying here, but they're basically going through a series of changes in behaviors and understandings on what the benefits are and why it's important to work a little bit more transparently or openly. Now, this is a big change for some organizations, and it's a huge change for some individuals. So not everyone's going to be able to make this transition. So while this matrix on the right kind of projects that there's a better way of working, that doesn't necessarily mean that a lot of people are going to realize that. What they need to do is kind of break through some of those black line barriers, because sometimes there's behavior changes that need to come with it. So keep that in mind as well, because it's really, really important. The last one that I want to show here is sort of an example, a really quick example of how this can transition month over month. So on the left, you see a type of organization that has pretty heavy usage of Outlook, Skype, and SharePoint intranets. And what we've done is, in this organization, these are just visualizations. Again, there's a lot more behind this. But what we did was we introduced change. So we introduced Yammer, and in their example, they used Yam Jams and some other things, and basically made Yammer this company communications method where there's a lot of interaction on company communications, but a lot of it is kind of urgent or high stuff. It's a little bit more organizational or large group or department based, not really individuals interacting as heavily, at least in Yammer. It's mainly at the organizational level. So that change basically meant that the SharePoint intranet was made into a social intranet. We connected it with the Yammer environment, and so this basically changed the dynamic of when you might use Yammer versus when you might use historically the SharePoint intranet. In the next phase, after month 2, we actually changed something really simple. We introduced OneDrive for Business. You'll notice that on the left, Outlook becomes less relevant for many scenarios because OneDrive for Business actually enables a lot of document sharing and collaboration that is better than Outlook, email attachments, and other methods. You'll also notice that SharePoint team sites have moved into smaller group sizes, and that's because as OneDrive for Business was released, a lot of users and groups started to realize, hey, I'd like to have a team site for this smaller group or collection of users. And so naturally, SharePoint team sites became more populated. There were more of them being requested, and they became more useful for non-departmental levels, which is really what we were seeing more in the month 2 and month 1 phase. And in month 4, perhaps we introduced something new like Office 365 groups. We also see more people creating smaller Yammer groups that are less urgent in terms of the communication that are in them, and so on and so forth, right? So as we introduce change over time in this organization, you'll notice that it slowly starts to look more like the target that they had for how they wanted, at least from a visual perspective, to represent how the users or the personas are working. Again, this is simplifying something that was much more complex because we had quite a few of these visualizations based on personas, and the way we captured the data was a little bit more complex. But you got the idea. You can actually visualize progress towards how people are actively using technology within your business with these matrices, right? And it is important to always show that time sensitivity and audience because those are critical components. Now, the next thing you're going to do once you've visualized and understand what you're trying to accomplish with your usage and with guiding user behavior, right, which is what we kind of talked about with the matrices, is you want to provide scenarios. So scenarios are specific circumstances where you're providing a little bit more prescriptive and clear guidance on when to use certain tools together or when to use certain tools over other tools. And so this is where we can get to a much more granular level. So what I'm suggesting is the method you use is you document some scenarios that make sense for your business. There's 13 in the white paper that you can kind of use as inspiration, if you will. And then, of course, we're going to walk through one today. We're going to walk through where should I put and share documents. In the Channel 9 presentation for this content, that's an hour and 15 minutes, we walk through 2 more. So if you want to see a little bit more, you can jump into that as well. So let's walk through scenario 1 here. The reality is when you put and share documents in Office 365, you can do that in a variety of ways. You can use it OneDrive for Business, you can use SharePoint sites, Yammer, I can attach files in an email, I can even use things like Office 365 groups. So this is a natural place where there's a little bit of confusion from users at times, or where they're curious on how to better work in Office 365 and they're looking for that guidance. So you should have guidance in this space. In this example, what we have is we have a OneDrive for Business site, and the guidance here is that if this is a document you own, right? If this is a document that's just for you, or it's a temporary place, right? You just need some place to put a document, then OneDrive for Business is a perfect place to put and share documents. There's lots of scenarios where you might share documents in OneDrive for Business. Now, if you're looking for something that's a little bit more permanent, or there's a sense that there's a shared, again, the permanency is more if it's really already shared ownership, there's a sense of shared ownership on the document, then in both those circumstances, there's shared ownership, you might want to put it somewhere else, like in a Office 365 group. So Office 365 groups are a great place if you have a shared collection of peers, colleagues, people that you trust, that you basically want to openly work with, right? So think of this as a collective or shared environment that goes a little bit better than the shared with everyone folder, or starting to create all these subsets of folders in OneDrive for Business. This is a better way of working. And of course, groups have other capabilities that are really beneficial when you start to work in this collaborative way with a group of people, like the calendars and the messaging and other stuff like that. But for now, think of it as, hey, I want to put and share documents with a collective group of people on a regular basis. That probably makes sense to put in a group. Next is scenarios where we have a little bit more complexity. What if I want to put and share a document, but I also want to have metadata on the document for a variety of reasons? Perhaps I have a process or a workflow or some sort of approval or something like that. Well, in those scenarios, then SharePoint is the right place to store the document. And then what if from a sharing perspective, I want to be much more granular with my sharing rights than I might have in a group? So I want to have, some people within this collection of users have this right, and some of them have this right, and so on and so forth. When you have those types of needs, again, SharePoint can sometimes be out of place for it because it has a little bit more capability and robustness when it comes to setting things like that up. Or if you wanted to connect the documents to other experiences that were critical that are built in SharePoint. There's a lot of other unique scenarios like document sets and so on and so forth, but you guys get the idea. There are times where SharePoint actually makes more sense to put and store documents. Now, you can put and share documents in SharePoint if that's where everyone's working. So if you're not rolling out groups yet, and most people are actually using SharePoint sites, and you have a collection of sites that represent what kind of groups do, that's okay too. Use the SharePoint sites, and then over time, perhaps find the right opportunities to use groups to complement or supplement, in some cases, scenarios that weren't as applicable in SharePoint. And then, of course, when we talk about sharing documents, we also want to talk about how we might share them. So if you're going to share documents, you might do that using Yammer Conversations. So this is on the right pane of any document in OneDrive for Business, in groups, or in SharePoint sites. We can actually share the document in Yammer. So this is a great way of sharing more broadly. So yes, this is absolutely a great way to share. Now the question was, where should I put and share documents? So now, of course, should I put documents in Yammer? The answer to this is no. Generically speaking, you don't want to store the documents in Yammer because there's better ways to put them in OneDrive for Business, groups, or SharePoint sites, and then reference them from Yammer. But of course, every time we make a decision and we say that this is the right way to do it, there's always exceptions. So there are times, unique scenarios, where it makes sense to store and share files within Yammer. An example of this was during the Microsoft Ignite presentations that we did. A lot of the slide decks were available in what we call the second screen inside of the Ignite Yammer network, which is an external network that many attendees and other people could go, look up sessions, comment on them, have conversations. And so this was a really interactive way of working, and it made natural sense since most of these people didn't have access to Microsoft's internal sites and other things like that, groups, things like that. We wanted to store this in Yammer. So there are times, with supporting an event, or you need to share a document with others and they can't have access to, for whatever reason, your groups or your SharePoint sites or your OneDrive for Business environment, then this is a great way of potentially sharing and putting documents. So at first I was saying, no, you shouldn't share documents or put them in Yammer, or you should share documents in Yammer through Conversation View and other things like that, but you shouldn't put them in Yammer. That's still true. Think of official documents. So finalized documents make a little bit more sense to put and share in Yammer, but when you're collaborating on documents, Yammer is really not optimized for that, whereas SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, and potentially groups are much more efficiently designed for those collaborative scenarios. So again, there are times to use Yammer. Hopefully that gives you an idea of how to maybe answer this question. And of course, you can attach documents in Outlook and send them, but you should never do this, right? Stop it. Stop attaching and sending Outlook attachments with documents inside of Exchange now. The goal is not to do this. The goal instead is to use either smart attachments or put a link to the document. So I might send a link to a SharePoint site or an Office 365 group or something like that. Or in Outlook 2016 or Outlook Web Access, I can actually add what we call a smart attachment, which is basically an attachment that points to a record in groups or SharePoint or OneDrive for Business. And it's cool because actually this capability gives me the ability to even say to the recipient, you have the ability to edit or view and so on and so forth. So there's some really interesting ways that this actually makes the sharing process a little bit more frictionless. So that's a great way of doing it, but the original way of physically attaching the document to the email, let's stop doing that. So here's a quick summary, right? Where should we put documents? Well, we should put them in SharePoint. We should put them in OneDrive for Business. We should put them in groups. We should put them in all those places, right? But there's situations where it makes sense to, say, use SharePoint over groups, or situations where it makes sense to use groups over OneDrive for Business. And conversely, there's times where actually Yammer does make sense, but not all the time. So while this may look simple, right, and the result that you provide to users in your organization is summaries like this, inside of the white paper, you'll see we actually have a listing of quite a few of these. While this may look simple, the reality is you have to explore the scenario with the user, right? You have to guide them through it so they can really understand when and which technologies should be used in which scenarios, and maybe how they can be better used together. One other thing I'll call out for you when you look at the scenarios that are in the white paper, of the 13, you'll notice that Outlook is rarely the best option. And the reality is, again, all of our research has shown clearly and evidently that Outlook is the #1 tool that people use in Office 365. So if that's the #1 tool, and we want to reconcile the fact that there's better ways people can work, so let's introduce them to those better ways and then guide them to use them together. Use Outlook and this. I'm not saying don't use Outlook. Again, it's really critical. Keep people with their familiar tools so that they still have them. Just introduce the ways that they can use those tools with other tools in Office 365 for added benefit and better results. And with that, that's really what I wanted to show you on the understanding side. So hopefully that made a lot of sense, because we'll jump into the next. Now let's talk about value and maximizing the value that you get from Office 365. So the secret here is if we've effectively driven interest and awareness, and we have developed and guided understanding, it's actually pretty easy to realize value, because that means people are actively using the platform. We see a lot of usage and adoption, and when people are using the platform, we actually see a lot of benefit. And of course, there's a lot of work that Microsoft is doing to make it easier for us to really understand the value that Office 365 is providing. And so some ways to look at this is to make inferences based on active use, and to base that on productivity scenarios that may have existed before. So you need a baseline, so this is important. Maybe even before you do a lot of the interest and guidance and other things you're going to do in Office 365, look at your baseline information. Now, you can use data that Microsoft provides in the tool, or you can do surveys and other techniques to try and understand kind of the current state of your organization, and then the optimized state, hopefully after you've done a series of activities and campaigns. The next thing to recognize for realizing and maximizing value is that it's important for all of us. So the more people actively use the platform, this is an example with Delve, the more people use Delve, the more powerful and useful Delve becomes. Similarly, if you have more active usage in Yammer and more people participating in Yammer, then Yammer is actually more valuable. Another example is Link Link Presence or Skype for Business Presence, which is the little green bar that you see there. That becomes really helpful the more people are actively on and leveraging Skype for Business. But if they're not actively on it, then again, it's not going to be something you're always going to rely on. Or if people aren't actively using it and it's not accurate, again, you'll run into issues. So again, the more people understand the technology, the more they actively use it and they use it in the right ways, the more value everyone gets from it. And it's much, much easier for it to eventually become a little bit self-sustained, right? In that people kind of perpetuate the best practices. We need to be careful to always intercede and provide additional guidance when there's changes or new opportunities, but it's definitely something that you can get to a pretty healthy state. In addition to this, one of the big secrets to having that healthy state is that groups level. Remember, we talked about there's an organizational level, there's an individual level, and there's a group level of guidance. It's really important to understand that most coworkers learn best through each other, right? They learn through peers, they learn through coaches, they learn through champions. And so it's really, really critical for you to invest in a lot of programs and activities and support in your organization to really give these champions, these coworkers or coaches, the capability that they need to be as helpful as possible. So again, everything from a literature perspective and everything from customers and research and surveys that we've done indicates that this is by far the best method. So we would really recommend you maybe double down if you're trying to maximize adoption and maximize the value that Office 365 can provide. You do that through investing a little bit more in coaches and champions. And then, of course, you need to build an adoption plan. So there's actually a set of resources at success.office.com that the Microsoft team worked really hard on. This is content from a variety of places. So please feel free to use this. There's methodology that's pretty straightforward. There's some sample scenarios. This is kind of, some of it's should be one-on-one, and most organizations are hopefully doing this and doing it well. And then some of it, for some organizations, maybe they've already taken the steps and they're a little bit further. It doesn't mean that if you've already deployed Office 365, it's too late to build an adoption plan. So no matter where you are and what stage you're in, if you've never been to success.office.com or you haven't been recently, I highly recommend going to success.office.com because it's going to be an active place where Microsoft and many community people eventually surface up content that's really critical for your continued success with Office 365. So that's another great way to maximize the value Office 365 is providing. And I know that's short and sweet, but with our time today, I think that's the best way to represent maximizing value. So now that we have driven interest and we've guided understanding and we've maximized value, or we've taken some steps to do that, what we want to do is sustain commitment. And sustaining commitment is actually quite easy. The secret to sustaining commitment is to understand that it's a shared responsibility. So the number one thing that we learned through the work that we did with many, many customers is that a lot of them kind of had this expectation that the tools would be so intuitive and it would be so obvious that every user would maximize their usage of, said tool. The reality is this is not true. It's definitely an aspiration that Microsoft is working towards. It's something that we would love to see inside of our own enterprises. But the reality is there's behavior changes. There's things that are changing for how people work. And in order for us to help guide users through that change, we have to take on, at least in our organizations, a part of that responsibility. And this makes sense because if you think about driving awareness and driving interest, we're better equipped inside of our organizations to do that than Microsoft might be in many cases, because it enables us to understand the context and the situation and the scenarios in our business better than having something that's more general sized or broader from an industry perspective. So again, understand and recognize it's a shared commitment and that all the things are shared that go under that. And then understand too that Microsoft's doing a lot of work to make this easier. So one of the examples is there's a what's new capability and they've added some tooltips tips inside of Office 365. So Delve has a first run experience, and I know it's really basic with 2 tips. You can actually go up to the top right, click on the gear icon and say show tips, but there's more coming that really is meant to help users understand, hey, what's changed, what's new, how might they be able to work a little bit better. Naturally, this is based on Microsoft's feedback, so feedback that comes from customers like yourself and from partners. So please, please, please actively use the user voice and the different sites that Microsoft has for different capabilities like Delve and groups and things like that, and give Microsoft feedback on what features you'd like to see and potentially which type of guidance you'd like to see a little bit more of. Keep in mind that this can be used for broader opportunities for having a dialogue with the product teams. And then, of course, it's really important to recognize the direction Microsoft is going. So the 2 big ones are Office 365 Groups and Office 365 the graph or Delve, and Delve is the experience for sort of discovery and other things. So when you think of the new Delve group experience, I think it's starting to hopefully represent for many people that where Microsoft is going is they're really working to make this much more intuitive, much more connected and integrated experience. And so it should make it more natural for the user to understand what they should use and when they should use it. And to this point, there's actually new reporting that Microsoft is working with that's a little bit, it's called the Delve Organization View, and there's more coming around this, but this idea that users are able to see how they behave with tools and potentially improve not just usage of the tools from these insights, but potentially improve the ways they work with other people inside the organization, the ways they collaborate, as an example, and the ways that they're productive. So on the left-hand side here in the Delve roadmap session, there was an example where, as an individual, I might work and meet with the sales team and the product team often, because again, this left side can be filtered. So I might say, show me all meetings and how meetings are sort of visually represented. And here I can see that maybe I'm meeting with the product team and sales team, but they're not meeting with one another. And so it makes a lot of sense to potentially suggest that the sales and product team need to meet more often. And so knowing from an organizational insight perspective to knowing from an individual insight perspective how I might be able to improve or how I'm actually working, that can be really, really supportive, especially when you start to complement this with suggestions, minor suggestions on how other people work in ways that potentially are a little bit more efficient or effective. So keep in mind that the future is very bright for sustaining the commitment, and it's going to become easier and easier as time comes on, but that in the short term, there's a lot of value from doing those activities that we've mentioned, driving interest, understanding, and then maximizing the value and leading to greater sustained commitment. So let's wrap this up. There are 3 basic steps we'd like to ask you guys to take part in. The first one is to develop organizational, group, and individual guidance, and that's based on everything you've learned in this session, as well as what you'll see in the white paper, success.office.com, and hopefully you'll leverage things like the activities that are in the improveit.how/book. Kanwal's chapter, in case you're curious, is about intranet measurements and activities to help drive intranet adoption, which is still very applicable in Office 365 since it's a great place for intranets. More on that later. And of course, give us feedback and share what's working for you. So keep in mind, this is not an easy question to answer, when to use what, and it requires you to understand the challenges and kind of the right approach. It's an and, not a versus. And then, of course, leverage everything you can from this deck as well as the white paper. We wish you the best there. Resources to help you be successful. We've actually gathered a variety of resources here inside of this deck. There's also many more. If we had time, we'd show you. Some of these, like these resources listed on this page, are resources that may be situational. So based on the date that this is recorded, these are available to our organizations. There will always be something, right? Some way that you can get things like software vouchers, or there might be some other adoption offer for FY16 or the next fiscal year for Microsoft. So again, keep in mind, talk to your Microsoft team, talk to your trusted Microsoft partner to make sure that you're getting the maximum benefits that you can. And with that, please, please, please feel free to reach out to us. We really love questions. We really like a lot of feedback, and we're hoping that we can learn, just as you are, how to better help users and organizations answer these really important questions on how to optimize usage in Office 365.